together as union members. At the same time, in other locations, they were beating each other.
Yes.
So people wonder how come Jimmy Hoffa disappeared. I'm not so sure that Jimmy Hoffa didn't disappear because he was trying to sort of bend the color rule at the time, and some people just didn't like it. Today people say, well, that can't be true, but they just don't understand how big of an issue it was back then.
Yeah. No, I think if you look at the history of unions in this country, you'll see that a lot of unions were in the forefront of being inclusive and trying to incorporate people of all color, genders into the unions. Generally, unions don't do hiring. It's an employer that does the hiring.
Right.
And so the unions have some limitations on what they can do to influence the hiring. So if you have an employer who's going to hire an all white or all black or all Asian staff, then the union's hands are somewhat tied. But a lot of unions were very active in during the anti-apartheid struggle in support of black workers in South Africa. I know I was involved with that. My union was. I actually got arrested once. Had a gold coin dealer in Boston who was marketing the Krugerrand, the South African coin.
Wow.
And it was the first of a series of arrests at this gold coin dealer.
Yeah. Well, I think that one of the, you raise an important issue, but I think that they do influence because there's union-based training, and they can just not accept the people into the union-based training, and so if you're not in the union training, then you can't get the job.
Like the apprenticeship programs in the building trades, right? Right,
and so there's a lot of other ways that I've seen that they just had, I was working, and they had a woman that just covers other women. They're all guests, and what she had was the first woman electrician in Atlanta on. And she was black, and so what it was is that not only was a woman in the trades, or Cincinnati, Cleveland, but it was a black woman in the trades, and so she did speak very well of the unions, and because the woman asked her, well, was there a big problem? And she said even though the unions were influenced by organized crime in the area, they still hired her. And organized crime has in the past had a history of racism.
Well, for me, there's a real sense of brotherhood, sisterhood, personhood in the labor movement. And relating to the posters, one of the ways I've collected posters is by visiting trade unions in different countries all over the world. And I'll just cite you one example. I was in Istanbul and went to a cultural center of a political party where one of the people I was talking to said, oh, you have to meet this guy who works for Petrolish, which is a chemical workers union there. So she called him, he came over, we talked. He invited my wife and I the next day to come to the union headquarters, where we went and we met with him, the international affairs guy, they both spoke English, which was good, and then the treasurer of the union, who didn't, but they could interpret. And it was really funny because the international affairs guy was explaining how he collected writings from different leading thinkers in the labor movement, translated them to Turkish, and then they gave them to their activists. And he started citing some names. He says, well, yeah, do you know a guy, Bill Fletcher? I said, yeah, he's a friend of mine. He's from Boston. He says, well, how about Kate Bronfenbrenner? I said, yeah, she used to be in Boston too. She's at Cornell now. And so he mentioned 4 people, and my wife and I knew all 4 of them. And he ran out and brought the books back and gave them to us.
Well, that's actually interesting, because one of the things that you sort of highlighted for me while I was listening to you is that by sort of the unionization of employees, especially in the chemical industry, you enhance the safety of a person surrounding some of the plants, and the reason being is you have to have a safe work environment for the union workers. Then that means that the environment has to be much safer for the people who are in the surrounding area, and I'm thinking of one place in particular, but I'm not going to mention it. And so as the union becomes sort of more assertive in their requirements for employee safety, then the employees, in a sense, make it a greener environment surrounding the chemical plant or other plants where there are those risks.
No, you're absolutely right. One of the exhibit themes I have is on health and safety, and it's posters from different unions around the world, and you look at them and you see, yes, it's going to protect the worker, but yeah, most of these are also going to protect, you know, the broader public.
Right.
People come into contact with
Right,
these
water and all the air,
Yeah.
everything. Can we get the next poster, Joan? Oh, speaking of women in the trades.
And speaking of integration of
Right.
equal employees, yeah, this is actually a poster from Massachusetts here, and the women depicted in that have worked at some point in the building trades here in Boston or Greater Boston.
How about the next one, Joan?
And unfortunately, this is a very real issue, death threat for trying to form a union. You've had people in this country who've been killed picketing or trying to form a union. In Colombia, you've had hundreds of trade unionists over the last 20 years who've been murdered by death squads, who've been simply trying to organize workers at their particular work location or being active in the labor movement. And this is an all too real thing in many countries.
How about another one, Joan? This was another one I liked a lot.
Yes, this one's from Spain, and it's for another general strike. And you have this very powerful fist. I think it's a great graphic, but had to do, I think it's from the CGT, which is a very militant union in Spain.
We also noticed that it's left hand.
Southpaw, huh?
Well, we didn't know, we were looking at it, if it was a relationship to the left.
Politically, or
yeah,
somebody who's
or
left-handed?
Yeah.
Good question.
Right.
Good question. I'm not sure.
I'm sure there's some symbolic meaning to it to somebody.
And it's advocating for pension reform and against this attempt to change the labor laws in that country for the detriment of the workers.
That last poster, Joan, the UMA.
Oh, United Mine Workers of America. This was another very big, you asked earlier about important events in the labor movement, support the Piston strikers. Piston was a coal mine, and the coal miners walked out and started to strike, and they had company goons that came carrying guns. There's actually a film made called Harlan County that was shot around this time, where you see these guys guarding the gates watching for who's coming into the plant, whether they're union members, and guys with guns tucked in their belts and things like that.
Well, when I was a child, I forget which strike it was, but there was one extended coal strike where the workers were actually trying to get their families out of the area because they just didn't have any money, and they were hunting to survive. And my parents took in a family that was from a coal mine.
Wow.
And I remember living with them, and we actually went down there several years later when things were nicer for them and whatnot. But I remember watching the news and everything, and they were looking and at the different places, because it was one of the strikes. How they used to have news coverage in this country. It was 24/7, and they were showing, and we got to see who the people were and stuff like that. But we were, I think I was 5.
Well, for your audience, if they're ever interested in seeing about the conditions of and trying to form a union in coal country, there's 2 great films. One's a documentary called Harlan County, and that I just mentioned, and the other is not a documentary. It's a film by John Sayles called Mattawan.
Oh yeah, I remember
that film, which is great.
Yeah,
and that actually talks about the issues of immigrant workers and the companies trying to divide workers by race.
Yeah, when I was getting my, I don't know if it was my master's or bachelor's degree, I sort of investigated the sort of the Irish migration, and I learned so much because I didn't realize how many different places they came in, and some of them were a little violent, but the whole thing, the evolution of the Irish acceptance and the beginning of the sort of the repulsion of the Irish, harp need not apply, or they'd have harps with the lines through them and stuff like that.
Well, you raised a couple of good things. First of all, there's a TV miniseries called The Titanic, Blood and Steel, I think it's called.
No, Irish Steel, don't go by it.
It's set in Belfast, and it's about the building of the Titanic. But 2 of the key things in there that go through the whole series are the workers trying to unionize and what they were up against. And then the second part is the sort of split between the Irish and the Catholics and the Protestants, and some of the union people trying to bring them together, put aside those differences. But the other thing, going back to Mad One about the companies pitting workers against each other, that's an old tool that's still used today of trying to divide people, whether it's by gender, by sexual preference, by race, nationality. And we see it, in my union, we would see it organizing in the private human service sector, where there's a lot of African workers working. And so they would go to, let's say, some white workers, and they'd say, look, if the union comes in, the African workers are going to be running things here. But this is the employers doing this. And trying to divide workers like that and put doubt in their mind whether they should vote for the union.
Well, it's sort of like the issue that I had mentioned to you about temp workers and the use of temp workers by the post office, the state of Massachusetts, the Middlesex County, and that these are not temp workers. I mean, if you've been regularly scheduled for 3 years, you're not a temp worker. You know, and but what happens is they do the same job. They just don't get any health care benefits. They don't get vacation. They don't get personal days. They don't get sick days. They don't even get the same wage. But it's good for administrators because then they can say, well, we have a balanced budget with full staffing. No, you don't have a balanced budget with full staffing because you've cooked the books.
Well, the international term for that is precarious work.
Precarious work. Oh, I like this.
And so, you know, another example of this would be where you have immigrant workers, maybe undocumented workers who are working at some plant doing jobs that a lot of people who grew up in this country don't want. And these immigrant workers are trying to survive. And if they try to form a union and band together for better working conditions, what happens is the company will call in immigration and have a raid, and first they'll threaten it, and then they might actually have the raid, and they'll have these people taken away, deported, and that destroys the whole union drive.
I had mentioned to you about the shelter. We're going to go in a minute, but one of the interesting things about the shelter was in one building, and right next to it was INS. And so sometimes we'd have the kids because they were born in this country, but the parents would be in the INS facility.
Right.
So, you know, do you want to get the two posters up real quick, Joan?
Actually, we were talking about Turkey earlier. This is from Turkey, 1st of May, May Day poster, which is the International Day of Working People in every country except the one it originated in, which is the US, where we call it Labor Day, and it's on a different day. And this graphic was actually used back in, I believe it was 1973, where they had a huge May Day rally in Taksim Square, this huge square in Istanbul. And what happened was that there were a number of people who were killed, trade unionists who were killed by police at the time. So the government banned May Day demonstrations until the year 2010, when they allowed it again. And so the unions produced, and a number of different unions produced posters like this for May Day, but using that same graphic.
That's pretty wild. And
they had that first renewed May Day demonstration brought 200,000 people to Taksim Square.
Wow. What's the last poster, Joan?
And this one is from the country of Oman. Another May Day poster, 1st of May. And you see the holding of one of the tools there, workers' use of tools.
Well, that's really interesting because we have so much diversion, divisiveness between sort of Islamic countries and Christian countries, but there's a sort of a mutual issue of labor, and so maybe we need to find what that sort of mutuality is instead of looking for the differences.
Well, you know, one of the things I hope to do with my posters is, because I do have posters from a lot of different countries, is that people can see that there are themes that unite people across different countries. International Women's Day. I have posters from Pakistan, from a women's organization celebrating International Women's Day. May Day, you saw this poster, but these are things that people have in common, so to look for people's similarities as opposed to their differences.
Well, thank you very much, Stephen. I really appreciate it. It's been wonderful. I wish we had done it longer.
Maybe we can do it again sometime.
Yeah, oh, we definitely have to. Thank you very much, everybody. Maybe you come on when I